Good morning, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. This morning we will be reading from a beautiful sutta, Anguttara Nikaya 368. So I will be putting the link on the live chat, and I believe you can pick between Bhante Sujato's translation or Venerable Tanisaro's translation. But I will be actually reading from Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. And yes, we can start reading, discussing a little bit, and whenever you are ready, you're welcome to put any comments or any questions in the live chat, and I'll try my best to address them. But before we move on, we can start by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham tamham sangham namassami. So the sutta begins. Bhikkhus, wanderers of other sects may ask you, friends, there are these three things. What three? Greed, hatred, and delusion. These are the three. What, friends, is the distinction, the disparity, the difference between them? If you're asked this, how would you answer? So it's interesting how the Buddha starts, this teaching by mentioning actually a hypothetical scenario of the monastic sangha encountering members of other different spiritual traditions, and then having to answer certain questions. And it's interesting because when I first read this, for example, what came to mind was how in the Tibetan tradition in particular, actually, the monastics are trained in debate. And so here it seems like there's a bit of a seed of that, of being ready to, it's not necessarily a competition, but rather it's a skillful means to really make sure that we understand the teachings of the Buddha, we really understand what the point of the path is. So we can make a case for the Dhamma, but also we can make sure that we don't get confused, in our path, and perhaps encounter other spiritual traditions and start deviating from the goal, which is the cessation of suffering. So it's very interesting how, since the time of the Buddha, fundamentally, there was this condition to, or there was this encouragement to really reflect, ponder on the teachings, and also with the idea in mind that there was going to be a sort of conversation or a debate about these concepts. And the monks reply, Bhante, our teachings are rooted in the Blessed One. Guided by the Blessed One, take recourse in the Blessed One. It would be good if the Blessed One would clear up the meaning of this statement. Having heard it from him, the bhikkhus will retain it in mind. Then listen, bhikkhus, and attend closely. I will speak. Yes, Bhante, those bhikkhus replied. So the monastic sangha replies to the Buddha by taking fundamentally the opportunity to learn from the Buddha. So they, instead of replying, they actually ask for the Buddha to elaborate what is the appropriate response. And the Blessed One says this, because if wanderers of other sects should ask you such a question, you should answer them as follows. Lust, friends, is slightly blameworthy, but slow to fade away. Hatred is very blameworthy, but quick to fade away. Delusion is very blameworthy and slow to fade away. This is one of my sort of delicious statements from the Buddha, from the suttas. Of course, one of the, as we like to say, one of my favorite suttas. But yeah, how poignant, in just a few words, the Buddha somewhat clarifies salient traits of greed, hatred, and delusion. And we see actually also the foundation of what we like to do in Buddhism a lot of times. This is Stan the cat, or a monastic cat that is very interested in greed, hatred, and delusion, since just like us, he suffers both from all three. But yeah, so a lot of times in Buddhist circles, we talk about the three types. So the greed type, the hate type, and the delusional type. And of course, it's very important to remember that we're all three. So we are a nice blend of all three ingredients. But that there is, when we talk about, I'm a hate type, or I'm a greed type, or I'm a delusional type, it's more like what is the sort of salient traits that are present in the mind. And it's interesting how the Buddha here describes greed as slightly blameworthy, but slow to fade away. So it's the most difficult to somewhat break down, somewhat to see. Well, that's fundamentally the most difficult, because we are in our experience is based out of the senses, right? So we constantly have sensory input. So it's difficult to actually see the drawback of sensual pleasure, because there is actually a big gratification in sensual pleasure. The Buddha says if there wasn't any gratification in sensual pleasure, we wouldn't be hooked on it, right? We're not that masochistic. We're a bit masochistic, but not that much. So there has to be something gratifying, in ice cream. Otherwise, we wouldn't stuff our face into it whenever we have the opportunity to it. So we focus obviously on the pleasantness, and we'll see it later on in the Sutta. The Buddha addresses that. But anyway, so the Buddha, I believe, says it's slightly blameworthy because it's somewhat, understandable and predictable. And hatred, on the other hand, he says, is very blameworthy, but quick to fade away. Very, very interesting. Very blameworthy. Well, I think we can all actually understand very quickly why the Buddha makes such a statement. If we've ever seen an angry person, or hateful person, or a terrible person, or ourselves, perhaps not while we're in our righteous indignation, but afterwards we're like, that wasn't terribly skillful. Or maybe we've seen a recording of ourselves while we're screaming and yelling these days with all this technology. That can definitely happen. Or like, oh, who's that monster? Oh, wow, it's me. Right? And of course, when we are in that, when ourselves or others are in those really strong emotional states, then there can, most often than not, there can be some very serious, harmful consequences through body, speech, and mind, actually. So obviously it's very blameworthy, but it's very interesting because it's also easy to fade away, in the way that if we become aware of the hatred in the mind, especially with spiritual practice, we start becoming more and more acquainted with the weeds of the mind, then we can actually use perhaps a direct hatred towards our hatred. You can get very disgusted by it and start plucking it away. So in one way, it's a little bit easier than it's easier to be disgusted by things that are disgusting than to be disgusted by things that look appealing. And delusion, the Buddha says, is very blameworthy and slow to fade away. So it's the worst of both worlds. And that's, of course, avijja, as we were saying in the straightly connected to avijja, to ignorance, to the root of all, fundamentally, our suffering. So obviously, it's very difficult to get rid of it. Otherwise, we would be fully enlightened by now. And also very blameworthy because it's fundamentally what is causing all our unwholesome defilements to come into being. It's also the most difficult to uproot. So the Buddha here gives us practical instructions on how to address these three unwholesome roots. And the Buddha continues by saying, but friends, what is the reason unarisen lust arises and arisen lust increases and expands? You should answer, an attractive object. For one who attends carelessly to an attractive object, unarisen lust arises and arisen lust increases and expands. This, friends, is the reason unarisen lust arises and arisen lust increases and expands. Sounds familiar? So, in other words, it's fundamentally obsessing about the pretty things in the world, the things that we like, while we're experiencing them, when we're not experiencing them, before we're experiencing them, after we're experiencing them. Reinforcing fundamentally the story of how great ice cream is, or how great an art exhibit is, or how great the looks of that particular person that we like is, whatever there is that is pretty, is that is attractive to us. So then we start reinforcing it in our mind, and carelessly, because we're not pondering, we're not aware, we're not mindful about this. We're just, what's the big deal? We kind of do it in a very instinctive way. So ayoniso manasikara, which is not yoniso manasikara, not careful attention, but careless attention, ayoniso, is actually our instinctive way to go about in the world. I like this, I don't like this. I want it to stop, I want it to continue. May I have this, may I have that? So we kind of just have this approach. And the Buddha tells us that the direct consequence of these actions of careless attention is that not only do we create the conditions for new craving to appear in the mind, but we also fuel whatever craving is in our mind to begin with. So if we like, for example, ice cream, and we start obsessing about ice cream and focusing on the creaminess of ice cream, then we fuel our craving for ice cream. But then we'll perhaps go like, oh, actually, this ice cream would also be great with some cookies on it. Hence the cookies and cream flavor, right? So then we never perhaps had any craving for cookies, but we add it on to our craving for ice cream. So it's endless. And actually, you can spend your life, or actually lives, countless lifetimes, really playing this game of how much more desire and greed for sensual pleasure can we pile up, can we increase. I definitely, prior to my Buddhist path, I definitely pursued that sort of path. And yeah, there's so many things, samsara is so full of interesting, actually very tasty things. But we have a big stomach but a small mouth. So there's anything that can ever really fill us. It's like constantly trying to, it's too much. Then the Buddha says, suppose they ask, but what, friends, is the reason unarisen hatred arises and arisen hatred increases and expands? You should answer, a repulsive object. For one who attends carelessly to a repulsive object, unarisen hatred arises and arisen hatred increases and expands. This, friends, is the reason unarisen hatred arises and arisen hatred increases and expands. So fundamentally focusing on this is so terrible, this is so awful, could be better, right? And it's remarkably very similar to how the process of greed works. It's basically um, the flip side of the same coin. It's very interesting. I used to be in industry, the fashion industry, that is based on greed, and it's actually full of hatred as well. Because actually they kind of work in tandem as well, right? If we got this, if we really wanted whatever, this robe, and that was it, then actually perhaps things would stop subsiding. But no, actually, we need to start also hating this robe in order to want a new one. Like, oh, that's so 2000 and late. I need, yeah, a purple robe. That's, the in robe of 2021. And then next year, 2022, or like, oh, actually the ochre robe, that tinge, from Isan in Thailand, I like that. That's much better. I hate this purple robe now. I can't see it anymore. No, so it's always going back and forth. And then the Buddha says, suppose they ask, but what, friends, is the reason unarisen delusion arises and arisen delusion increases and expands? You should answer, careless attention. For one who attends carelessly, unarisen delusion arises and arisen delusion increases and expands. This, friends, is the reason unarisen delusion arises and arisen delusion increases and expands. So essentially, as we were saying, delusion is just careless attention. Fundamentally, it's caused by careless attention, and delusion fundamentally causes greed and hatred. And then the Buddha continues, suppose they ask, but what, friends, is the reason unarisen lust does not arise and arisen lust is abandoned? You should answer, an unattractive object. For one who attends carefully to an unattractive object, unarisen lust does not arise and arisen lust is abandoned. This, friends, is the reason unarisen lust does not arise and arisen lust is abandoned. So this is the beauty of the teachings of the Buddha. The Buddha not only, tells us how things are, what is, the condition of suffering and the cause of suffering in our experience of life, but he also gives us a way out of suffering, right? So he gives us always solutions, practical solutions to address the tendencies of mind that we're having. And so we see here that he's suggesting to pay attention to the drawbacks. For example, when we are experiencing craving. So clearly, whenever we follow our greed tendencies, as we were saying earlier, we focus on how pleasant our object is. And the Buddha suggests, well, how about you also pay attention to the drawbacks of the situation? So the gratification, we've got it down. Now, what is the danger of this situation? Pay attention to it. And in that way, you're not that roped in. Mara has less of a grounding where to land. And we also start eroding the delusion as well of, actually thinking that one object or one person or one whatever it is that we want is fully pleasant, is fully great. Aside from ice cream, we also have that approach with relationships as well. We tend to obsess so much with all the pretty things that we see when we first encounter someone. And we don't actually notice at all the imperfections that they have, both physically and, emotionally, or, they're obviously a bundle of greed, hatred, and delusion as well as we are. And that becomes more noticeable as time goes by. And we're kind of surprised. We're like, hey, wait, I thought you were, this great person. And actually, the person is still great, is as just as great as when we first met them. It's just that we're getting a more realistic sort of understanding of it, of the situation. It becomes more real, more genuine. So in the metaphor, getting back to the ice cream, once again, we tend to focus on the creaminess of the ice cream, but the reality of ice cream is both ice and cream. And ice is actually usually quite unpleasant when we start paying attention to it. But when we start paying attention to it, we start piercing our delusion of, oh, I love this thing. This is the real great thing. I mean, it's still like a pleasant feeling. It's not unpleasant, but it's not that like absolutely necessary in our lives, that unless we have ice cream every day or once a week or once a month, we're going to be very unhappy. Because actually we have a full experience of, like a full real experience of ice cream. We start seeing it for actually what it is. And it's the same with anything in the world, which doesn't mean that we don't deal with anything, especially as lay people. But rather, one thing is to, take this clock and put it on the hand, and another thing is like smearing it with glue, putting it here, and then trying to rip it off. That would be very painful. But if we just learn how to hold things without getting attached, then it actually can be something skillful, useful, and without having any suffering. So then the Buddha continues, suppose they ask, but what, friends, is the reason unarisen hatred does not arise and arisen hatred is abandoned? You should answer, the liberation of the mind by loving kindness. For one who attends carefully to the liberation of the mind by loving kindness, unarisen hatred does not arise and arisen hatred is abandoned. This, friends, is the reason unarisen hatred does not arise and arisen hatred is abandoned. So it's very interesting how the Buddha here doesn't say that the solution is to pay attention to sort of the positive sides of the experience when we are, experiencing hatred, but rather instead to generate wholesome mind states. So even though in the first part of the sutta, we see that the manner through which we get hooked in greed and hatred is the same. And so there was a parallel to it. In the solution, here it's a little bit different. There's a bit of a discrepancy. So when it's greed, is to focus on the drawbacks, but when we're already focusing on the drawbacks, we don't need to really cultivate greed, but rather actually grow the mind in terms of wholesomeness. So it seems that also there's an interesting connection, and also what the Buddha was saying, why it's hatred is blameworthy but quick to fade away. Because if we're already not too wrapped up with sensual pleasures, not too obsessed with sensual pleasures, we're already kind of like halfway there. It's somewhat okay. It's an easier place to be than when we are completely obsessed with them. And so we can take that to our advantage and shift, like turn our mind towards the wholesome. Create the conditions for loving kindness to arise in the mind. So not something that is physical, tangible, but actually something that is a cultivation of the mind. And then the sutta ends. Suppose they ask, but what, friends, is the reason unreasoned delusion does not arise and a reasoned delusion is abandoned? You should answer, careful attention. For one who attends carefully, unreasoned delusion does not arise and a reasoned delusion is abandoned. This, friends, is the reason unreasoned delusion does not arise and a reasoned delusion is abandoned. And essentially, this is what we need to cultivate all the time, and also basically what the purpose of mindfulness is, which is not necessarily to be just in the present moment or something, those definitions that are often given, but then start losing a little bit their essence, their meaning, their relevance to our lives, but actually really observing, contemplating, reflecting on the Dhamma, seeing things as they truly are. We've had so many different teachings this past month, the whole month of September, on dependent origination. And basically, dependent origination is a teaching of emptiness. So seeing how this clock, is dependently arisen. There are so many different causes and conditions that create what I see that is a clock. So hence, the clock is empty of its inherent existence. And it's the same with all of our defilements of mind, all of our cravings, all of our hatred, all of our delusions. There are different causes and conditions that we study, we see. Through careful attention, we start learning, becoming acquainted with the mind, becoming familiar with the mind. And then we start putting the right causes and conditions in place to get the wholesome results that the Buddha tells us to put in place. And so I wanted to share this sutta with you all because it seems like a very practical way that the Buddha gives us instructions on how to address our defilements in everyday life. And we can all do it, whether we have robes on or no robes on. It's not really important. What is important is that we practice the Dhamma. All right. So at this point, if you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to type them in. Good to see you, Geeta, Jonathan, Michael, Kumu, Jayanta. Jonathan says, is there an email address I can write to you and Bhante Sudazo in general? Actually, yes, you can write to info@emptycloud.org and someone will reply to you. Sometimes sooner rather than later, sometimes later rather than sooner. It depends on what is happening here at the monastery. And hello also to Melinda, Ion, Ferdushi, Shwem, Chitsue, and Janna as well. While there doesn't seem to be any questions or comments. Do you have any thoughts?
So straightforward.
Okay, yeah, it's very straightforward. You can't really argue with the Buddha. All right. Hello to also Dan. Well, I'll give you a few moments and we'll see. All right. Well, okay.
These are the three main defilements, right? Greed, hatred, and delusion.
The three roots.
Three roots. Can you talk a little bit about the taints and how they differ?
Yes. Well, actually, we're going to have a special of that for the entire October. So, because I have also similar questions. The taints, I just gave a big talk on the Sabbasava Sutta, which is all the taints. So everything is related, interconnected, but there are a lot of different subtleties between the what we call the taints, so the asavas, kilesas, and then the unwholesome roots, and then the anusayas, the latent tendencies. So everything is interconnected, but it's long sort of. Yeah, I think it would be good if a senior monk actually elaborated on it rather than myself at this time. Because I have more questions than I have answers. All right, anything else? Good. All right, may you all be well, happy, and peaceful. And we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.